Welcome to the deep dive. What if we told you that Canada, a nation often seen as this really steadfast ally and peacekeeper, is actually facing some pretty serious questions about its military strength and its most vital defense relationship?
It's a really interesting contrast, isn't it? Because Canada works hard on that image, stability, cooperation.
Yeah.
But yeah, our sources today, they show a much more complex picture, sometimes quite challenging for the armed forces.
Exactly. So today, we're going deep into Canada's military world. We'll look at its history, those big contributions.
Yep.
Then we'll examine the current state of readiness, which is, well, we'll get into that.
Right.
We'll dissect that absolutely critical defense partnership with the U.S.
Crucial.
and really delve into the challenges that Canadian Armed Forces personnel themselves are facing. Our mission really is to cut through the noise, unpack what's actually happening, and give you a clearer, more nuanced picture of what it all means for Canada, on the world stage.
And to do that, we've pulled together a lot of material. We've got recent analyses from the Hill Times, War on the Rocks, official government reports, military stats, historical accounts too.
Right.
And even some really candid stuff from people actually serving in the CAF right now. So yeah, a pretty comprehensive look.
Okay, so let's kick things off with a foundation, right? The Canada-U.S. defense relationship. People always say ironclad, deeply entrenched, super successful, gives both countries more security than they'd have alone.
Yeah.
But, how did it get so fundamental?
Well, the depth of it is what's really striking. It goes back decades. You've got the Permanent Joint Board on Defense, the PJBD. That started way back in 1940.
Wow, 1940.
Yeah, advising on continental defense, reporting straight to the PM and the president, then the Military Cooperation Committee in 46, and of course, NORAD.
Ah, NORAD. Everyone knows NORAD.
Exactly. North American Aerospace Defense Command, set up in 58, handles aerospace warning control, maritime warning for North America. And it's telling, isn't it, that a senior Canadian officer is traditionally the deputy commander there.
Yeah, that is significant. And it's not just shared command structures, is it? Canada has a huge role maintaining the North Warning System.
That massive radar buffer across the Arctic,
Yeah.
800 kilometers long.
Huge. And then there's the day-to-day stuff, like the Canada-U.S. Civil Assistance Plan, military helping out in emergencies.
Floods, fires, hurricanes, earthquakes, even terrorist attacks.
And our sources show the CAF and U.S. Coast Guard working together constantly. Search and rescue, drug surveillance, illegal migrant interdiction.
So with all that interdependence, it begs the question, right? Where are these cracks that some reports are talking about?
Yeah. The Hill Times especially mentioned recent headlines suggesting strains. And the core issue seems to be, money. Canada's underinvestment in defense.
Leading to more reliance on the U.S. military, yeah.
And that reliance, it gets pretty interesting when you add in the political side. President Trump was very critical of Canada's spending.
Very vocal, yeah.
And our sources even bring up his past comments about, potential annexation, which is quite something.
It is. But then you contrast that with Canada's Chief of the Defense Staff, General Carignan. She says the military-to-military relationship itself is still very stable and very strong, despite political noise.
So how do those two things work together? Politics is strained, but military ties are strong.
Well, it's that key difference, isn't it? Political talk versus what happens on the ground operationally. At the working level, those military ties are still incredibly tight.
Okay.
But you can't ignore the reality of military might. The sheer difference in capability is just overwhelming. The U.S. has, over 8,000 M1 Abrams tanks?
In Canada?
Canada has 200.
Wow.
And U.S. nuclear subs, 72 of them. Canada has 4 advanced diesel subs.
So it's more than just numbers on a spreadsheet, right?
Yeah.
What's the deeper effect here? Does this gap change the dynamic of this supposedly ironclad alliance?
That's the core insight, I think. How this reliance might actually limit Canada's own foreign policy choices. Does partnership become, strategic dependency when it comes to hard power? And we see Canada's military pushing for sole source deals for American gear. HIMARS, rockets, Boeing surveillance planes, drones from a U.S. company.
And the tech control too, right? Like with the F-35s.
Exactly. The U.S. controls a lot of the tech on Canadian equipment. Software, hardware upgrades for that $19 billion F-35 fleet. That's significant control.
Okay, so the numbers are stark. But does this mean Canada is, defenseless?
No, not at all. Our sources are really clear on that. Canada isn't defenseless. It has a professional military. Its geography is huge and hard to control.
Sure.
And it has strong alliances, NATO, NORAD, plus, significant international standing. It's not isolated.
And speaking of NATO, Didn't leaders just agree to boost defense spending? Something like aiming for 5% of GDP by 2035?
Yeah, a big hike agreed upon at a recent summit, definitely spurred by U.S. pressure, but also, the changing world situation.
Okay, so with that global context set, let's pivot. Let's look inside at the Canadian Armed Forces themselves.
And
A picture of readiness. Well, it sounds pretty bleak, honestly.
it does. An internal report apparently shows, on average, only 45% of the Air Force fleet is operational.
Less than half.
Less than half. Navy, 46%. Army, 54%.
So, wow. That means even what they call Canada's minor military projection ambition, just 3 frigates, 2 fighter squadrons, 1 mechanized brigade even, that isn't guaranteed.
That's what the sources suggest, not assured. And it's striking, right? Ninth largest economy globally, 12th per capita, but contributing relatively little to Allied security. Can't always be relied on in a crisis, is the implication.
And even with that spending increase we mentioned, 70% between 2017 and 2026, full recovery, getting things back up to speed, could take at least a decade.
A decade, yeah, that's the assessment. Which tells you something about historical priorities, doesn't it?
It really does. Canadians have historically put social programs ahead of defense spending. Mostly.
Mostly, yeah. Big exceptions, of course. World War I, World War II. Huge contributions then. Massive sacrifices. That reminds you of a time when Canada absolutely did prioritize defense globally.
And those contributions, they were incredible. You look at Dieppe, August 42, nearly 5,000 Canadians, mostly inexperienced, landed. 60% casualties.
Just staggering.
The Italian campaign, 43 to 45, first big combat for Canadian divisions since World War I, over 25,000 casualties.
A brutal campaign.
And D-Day, June 44, the 3rd Canadian Division on Juno Beach. Heavy casualties again, but they pushed deeper into France than any other Allied troops on day one. These weren't small efforts.
No, they were absolutely pivotal. And, one lasting legacy is that deep connection between Canada and the Netherlands. The tulips every year.
Oh yeah, the tulips in Ottawa.
That comes from Canada, sheltering the Dutch royal family during the war, and, playing a key role in liberating the Netherlands. It's a really deep bond.
It really shows that human side of conflict, those connections. And back home during the war, sources talk about kids collecting scrap metal, rubber, shoes, older teens joining the workforce. They even lowered the driving age to 14.
Incredible mobilization. And Indigenous Canadians played a big part, too, donating money, collecting materials, Inuit collecting animal bones for ammo.
Though our sources note it was complex. Labor shortages helped financially for some Indigenous families, but conscription had negative impacts, too.
Right. And after a spending bump for the Korean War, Canadian defense spending just started this slow but steady decline from the late 50s. It never really got back to that early Cold War peacetime level, even with a big equipment update in the mid-70s.
So this history of maybe reluctance to fund the military robustly, that leads us straight to today's problems, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It helps explain the current pretty big recruitment hole the CAF is facing.
Which is partly the pandemic's fault, but also that reputational hit from those sexual misconduct scandals involving senior leaders.
Yeah, those scandals really hurt trust and attractiveness as a career.
And the CAF is trying hard to increase diversity. They removed policy barriers for women, visible minorities, but the sources say people are not flooding into recruiting centers.
No, there's that specific target, right? 25% women by 2026 needs a 1% increase each year.
But where were they in 2020?
Only 16%. So yeah, hitting that 2026 target looks increasingly unlikely.
What does that struggle tell us about the military as a place to work?
Well, it suggests there are still perceived barriers, right? One recommendation mentioned is an independent reporting center for sexual misconduct, like a U.S. model that actually saw reporting go way up.
So building trust might help?
Could be key. And beyond that, they're even talking about mandatory service. It's popular in places like Switzerland. 73% voted to keep it.
But probably unpopular here in Canada.
Likely, yeah. But military leaders are apparently considering if it's viable just to get the numbers up for a more robust force.
Okay, this brings us to something really interesting from the sources. These anecdotal comparisons between Canadian and U.S. military skills. Like the story of 2 Canadian truckers doing a job that took 10 U.S. soldiers.
Yeah, because the U.S. soldiers had really narrow specializations, needed multiple handovers.
So what was behind that? Different systems.
Totally different approaches. The U.S. recruits huge numbers, trains them for very specific, often narrow jobs, and then releases many after maybe 5 years. They basically become a skills generator for industry.
Huh. Interesting way to put it.
Whereas the CAF tends to have an older force, personnel stay longer, trained more broadly. They're adaptable, but sometimes there's that risk of being, mile wide, inch deep.
So, like, a U.S. radar operator might only do air or surface, but a Canadian does both.
Exactly. Or U.S. Army drivers aren't allowed to do most maintenance on their vehicles. Technicians do that. Canadians often get trained to handle more themselves.
Right. Okay, let's shift focus again. Let's zoom right in on life in the CAF. Beyond the uniform. Officially, the CAF says competitive salaries, world-class benefits, health, dental, vision, 4 to 6 weeks paid vacation, pension, training.
Paid education plans, too. ROTP officers get, $2,300 a month while still in university? Sounds pretty good on paper.
Yeah, it does sound good on paper, but
Yeah.
then you connect it to what members actually say.
And it gets more complicated. Yeah, that NCM non-commissioned member pay, it's good when you are single and in your teens to mid-20s,
Okay.
but it's bad when you are in your 30s trying to buy a home in Halifax, Ottawa, or Victoria and start a family.
Oof, that's a really stark reality check. So after tax, pension deductions, a new member might only take home $1,500 per paycheck, trying to afford rent in Ottawa, like $2,000 for a one-bedroom.
Yeah, it's tough. A real struggle on a single income.
Yeah.
Especially for a family of 3 or 4 trying to make it on maybe $75,000 a year.
And spouses often face chronic underemployment because of all the moves, deployments, training.
Right. Frequent relocations make stable careers for spouses really difficult. This isn't just about money, is it? It's got to affect recruitment, keeping people in.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is that perception that U.S. military folks are paid a lot better.
Yeah, that perception seems widespread, probably driven by things like free housing on base in the U.S., subsidized programs, higher PLD or per diem rates when traveling.
Whereas in Canada, while you get help with moving costs, realtor fees, movers, posting allowances, the actual pay stagnates in bureaucracy.
And regimented, retroactive minor increases that sometimes keep up with inflation and often do not. That's a direct quote capturing that frustration.
Yeah. But then there's this other powerful quote that really hits home about motivation. We didn't join for the money.
Right.
For instance, right now in my career, I make about 2/3 of what I would elsewhere, but would sacrifice other things that now have more value than cash in the bank.
That says so much about dedication, doesn't it? About service over salary.
It really does.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Basic training, BMQ, basic military qualification, 9 weeks. Turning civilians into soldiers, 4 pillars. Conduct, resilience, fitness, military skills. What's that like?
It's intense. Designed to be immersive, transformative. You get your kit week 1, learn drill, military dress week 2. By week 5, weapons simulators, radio comms. Week 6, that mandatory force fitness test.
And you live and work together, right?
Yeah.
No visit for the first month.
Exactly. Builds that unit cohesion, discipline. But it's not just about breaking you down. Sources emphasize the support instructors using mentorship, coaching, trying to ensure everyone succeeds.
And graduation day is described as heartfelt, leaving with skills, resilience, confidence.
Yeah, a real sense of accomplishment. And beyond training, there are some, unique perks later on, like that verified traveler status at some airports.
Oh, right. Keep liquids, shoes, belts on through security. Small thing, maybe, but nice.
Definitely an improved experience there. But it does bring up the flip side, work-life balance. That's often cited as a huge challenge.
Especially for military couples, right? Both having to say goodbye to kids for deployments, exercises. That must be incredibly tough.
Incredibly. Yet you still hear that sentiment that a forces career lets you discover skills I never knew I had, achieve beyond your perceived limits.
So demanding, challenging, but potentially very rewarding on a personal level.
That seems to be the takeaway, a complex picture.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what does this mean for you listening? We've covered a lot of ground here. Canada's military, those deep U.S. ties, the readiness issues, the personal stories of service members.
Yeah.
When you think about how a nation invests in defense, it really does say a lot about its priorities, its values, its place in the world, especially a world that feels like it's constantly changing.
It does.
So what stands out to you about Canada's unique defense situation? How might all these factors, the internal challenges, the external pressures, that crucial U.S. relationship, how might they shape Canada's influence and role going forward? Something to think about.